Has anyone seen Civil War yet? I don't think this would be spoiling anything. And in many ways, there's really not much to spoil. I think the broad concept is interesting in the way that it sort of projects the horrors of war onto a familiar landscape, right? For Americans, also for the rest of us that live within Anglophonic visual culture. If there's one thing it does really well, it's that it lays bare the horrors of war. I've found myself probably thinking far too much lately about, and I'm sort of smirking, although it's not particularly amusing, about what would it mean for the UK to enter into a substantial conflict, like in the coming years. Also thinking about the politics of military violence, right? When is it ever justified to use violence offensively, defensively, etc.? I'm always someone who's had a strong pacifistic response to conflict, but there are times where that gets really challenged, right? Where you see a certain thing happening in the world and you go, okay, yeah, but what was my response? Would that be right? If the UK got invaded by XYZ, would I just be like, oh, hey, whatever? There are some people in the US at the moment who almost relish the idea of a domestic conflict. Probably, I think it would be fair to say that most of those people probably do exist on the right. I'm sure there probably also are some on the left as well that would like to just like have it out or whatever. And this film is maybe an interesting intervention in that conversation. Jesse Plemons plays this kind of the guy who's with a small group who have kind of, it's not entirely clear whether they're actually attached to a wider military structure or whether they're kind of just people who have taken advantage of the fact that war's broken out. This is a pretty powerful, I would say, a moving kind of sequence. There's also just some of the bits where it does just place you in the midst of a little skirmish. The sound design is really good to the extent that, I don't know, particularly being in IMAX where more, as much as anything, it was just really loud. I did feel that sense of like, yeah, this is pretty horrible, and I think we should try to avoid circumstances like this. The odd thing that the film does, my understanding is that they've tried to do it from a perspective that is interesting. My feeling is that it didn't work. Is that it avoids giving a specific politics to any of the participants in the conflict that the film portrays. Like, because the film avoids at all costs, like, doing a politics. Although, the kind of exception to this is that Nick Offerman's character is, like, sort of Donald Trump. He's a president who's in his third term. I don't know, he's more clear-cut than Trump, but there's just sort of aspects of it that feel like he's nodding and winking towards that, even if it's not meant to, like, specifically be Trump. I think the idea is that there's, like, three factions within it. There's the United States, there's Texas and California have succeeded, and then there's one other group that succeeded as well, I think. Sorry, so it's the Loyalist states, which are still like the United States. There's the Western forces, which have succeeded and are like the main combatant with the United States during the film. And then there's the Florida Alliance gets mentioned. To be fair, I can't even mention the New People's Army getting mentioned. They throw in like something about the Portland Maoists at some point. This map doesn't make a huge amount of sense, like specifically the California and Texas teaming up, not only geographically, but also like politically. I think that is intentional in order to sort of throw you off in terms of politics and go like, these two sides could be whatever. So I think what they're clearly trying to do, and I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing to try and do in some context, is that they're trying to avoid you being in a position where the politics that you bring with you into the room provokes you to like pick a side that you think is the correct one, right? So that I guess the fear on Alex Garland's mind is that if Nick Offerman's character was definitely Joe Biden, that if you're a Joe Biden liberal, you go, well, I think he's probably correct then. I'm going to root for him. Or if he's definitely Donald Trump, you go, oh, well, then he's the baddie and we should want the other team to take him out. So the story follows Kirsten Dunst's characters and Kaylee Spenny is her name, I think. You basically follow these war reporters. They're photojournalists who are trying to cover the conflict, which is an interesting angle to take on it. I actually think it would have been more interesting to see a film about photojournalists in an actual conflict, because it felt like the emotional response I came away from it with was more relating to the art and ethics of war photojournalism more than it was to do with the kind of high concept Civil War stuff. Like there's a bunch of really interesting kind of thematic questions about what it means to be someone whose job is simply to report on a war. So both in terms of like how that can be a really horrific experience to be someone whose job is just taking photos of like horrific acts being committed, but also in terms of what does it mean to be witness to atrocities and to like not intercede and just to take photos of it. I think Kirsten Dunst has this line about our job isn't to ask questions, our job is to take photos and let other people, so that other people can ask the questions later or something. And that aspect of it is really, really interesting, and is more interesting than any of the kind of high concept stuff about the Civil War. So I almost would have preferred to have watched a film about an actual photojournalist in an actual conflict, because I think there could have been a really interesting story there. Spoiler, but this isn't a spoiler. They never explain it at all. Nothing in this film ever gets explained, which becomes necessary because the moment you try and put any detail onto the events, you instantly get a politics. And the film really wants to avoid assigning politics to either side, which means that it can't give you too much of an explanation of why and how Nick Offerman's president has become president for a third term, because then you would have something to go on in terms of trying to interpret his politics. And that ends up in a position where it actually just doesn't feel like it has a lot to say. If it felt like the film had at least a thesis on the US is potentially heading towards a civil war scenario, which I don't necessarily think that it is, but the film at least is suggesting that that is not beyond the realms of imagination. It feels like what it also needs to have is some suggestion for how the country would get there, and therefore some suggestion of like, well, what could be done differently. Not that the film needs to have like some sort of like programmatic, like, here's how to avoid a civil war in the US, but it means that the film ends up being a kind of war is bad, which I 100% agree, but feels a bit like something that probably most people could agree with on some level. See, my assumption was that the kind of takeaway would be a slightly rose-tinted liberal view of remember before 2016 when there was less politics and everyone got on, which is always a slight misremembering of the past, right? This idea that, remember just 10 years ago, everyone got on all the time, there was none of this political division, etc. In fact, there's been political division for a very long time, but it doesn't even manage to do that. You know, it doesn't even have anything to say about like the internet or whatever, or the media, because even though they're press journalists, like Kaylee Spenny, which might not be how you say her name, like her character shoots on black and white film the whole way through, which is probably not the most practical option for if you want to be a war photojournalist. I think I was saying a moment ago, I've been watching both Band of Brothers and The Pacific recently, and in that scenario, you are following characters who are, broadly speaking, well-meaning, good-natured characters, and who are fighting for a cause which is just and right. You're following members of the US military during the Second World War. In terms of conflicts that the US has been involved in, that's one where you can broadly say that the intent, that like the thing that they were fighting for was on the quote unquote the right side of history. Yet it is still like really difficult to watch at times, right? All of those soldiers go through horrific things. Some of those soldiers sometimes commit atrocities whilst trying to fight for something that is a broader good. And that is really challenging to watch, because you are on the side of the characters that you're following, but then like one of the secondary characters executes a prisoner of war, and that leaves you with the feeling of like, oh, even when the cause is correct, and even when like the army, the side that I think is good, is fighting for the right thing, horrors still happen during wars. Like that is a really challenging thematic kind of political thread to have in a film. And also the fact that it is specific to an actual conflict that has happened also grounds it, and you go, no, this is a thing that actually happened, right? Normal people who lived ordinary lives were suddenly conscripted and sent to another country to fight, witnessed atrocities, and it was horrible, right? That is a really challenging political thread to come away with. This just doesn't quite feel like it manages that, because by making it non-specific, it makes it harder to latch onto and to feel that kind of same emotional pull from. And just as you don't end up rooting for anyone, it probably makes it easier to also assume that all the people doing bad things are on the other side or whatever. Whereas films, TV shows that do engage with what it means for a force, for soldiers to be fighting for something that you broadly think is correct, and yet they're doing horrible things or experiencing horrible consequences, like that is a much more challenging proposition to me. The scene at the beginning of Band of Brothers where one of them just shoots up a bunch of prisoners of war, like that is a really complex political sort of moral thread to serve an audience with, because, you know, do you go, oh, well, we probably should have just like let Hitler carry on then? We're like, no, you don't. And yet you still go, war is horrible, war is hell, right? Whereas this kind of gives you, it just isn't as complex because there isn't stuff to latch onto. So it's an interesting film. It's worth seeing in cinemas. I think the sound design is wonderful. I think some aspects of the kind of road trip nature of it are interesting. There are some aspects where you go, yeah, like war is horrible, we should not do that. I think the avoidance of politics within it makes it lesser rather than makes it better. I can see why they tried to do it, but I don't think it necessarily works.